All right. So, did everything go okay with his?
Yeah, she's upstairs. She's
Okay,
okay.
okay.
She'll be crying in a minute.
Okay. We'll get her. And so we'll try to keep our heads like in the middle this time.
Okay.
Okay. So, Paul, thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Okay. So, I think that one of the things that people just really appreciated last time we did this was just starting to cover some of the information about how immigration works and then what we're seeing in the news compared to the reality of the situations. I think a great starting point, somebody asked the question, why are children being separated from their parents at the borders? And that's a real gut punch when we see that. It's very emotional. So can you address that issue at this point?
I don't know 100% why children are being separated. I think part of it has to do with, because it wasn't always the way, but I think that the space is limited, and I think that they're just doing the best they can with the resources in terms of putting people together. There's certainly been stories of people who have brought children with them, and the children really aren't their kids. They just have heard it was easier to get in if you have children, and so they have kids with them that may or may not be theirs. It could be a niece, a nephew, a cousin, or just some kid that they've sort of been traveling with and are claiming that it's their child. So I don't know that the plan was specifically we're going to separate kids on purpose. I think one of the things that the government is trying to do is certainly create a deterrent. One of the things that can lead to higher levels of illegal immigration is when it becomes attractive. If you know that if you show up at the border and you have a tale of woe where you're very afraid to return to your country, if they make a credible fear determination and they say, yes, you do have a credible fear of returning to your home country, you're allowed to enter the country, the U.S., and file an application for asylum. And that's a process that's been abused. If I just show up and I say the right things, they're going to let me in the U.S., and I can stay here, get a work permit, and actually live in the U.S. for a year or two or longer while I'm waiting for my case to be adjudicated. And many of those people will never appear for an asylum interview or for a court date, and so they just sort of vanish into the woodwork. And that's where I felt like the tactic that President Trump came up with, I was kind of surprised no one had thought of this before. When so many people were, coming to the border at the same time, seeking asylum, he kind of, he made a procedure where you could still approach an officer at the border and make a claim for asylum. However, his rule was that you can no longer remain in the U.S. while you're waiting for your case to be adjudicated. And so the legality of that has been debated. Do they have a claim to make asylum? Do they have a right to make a claim for asylum? Yes, they do. Do they have a right to be in the U.S.? I don't know. There are rules that control that, regulations. And it's one of those things where, if only a few people were filing for asylum, you wouldn't have the uproar. But, when thousands of people show up all at once, all trying to make claims, the system itself gets overburdened. And I mentioned that last time, just in terms of the detention. One of the big policy changes is that many more people who are subject to being deported are now, they're being placed in detention rather than being considered non-detained cases where they can just show up in court at a later date. And I think by making it unattractive or not as appealing just to show up illegally, they're hoping it's going to cut down on illegal immigration. I'll give you one example of, a very clear example in recent history. June 15th of 2012, President Obama created a program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And it was basically a way for...
That's DACA, right?
DACA, that's right.
DACA. People will recognize that from
right.
the news, DACA.
So these DACA kids, the idea was the president identified a group of people who would be considered a low priority for deportation. These would be kids, people that were brought to the U.S. before they reached their 16th birthday. And he announced that on the effective date was June 15th, 2012. In order to qualify, you had to demonstrate you had been in the U.S. at least 5 years. You had to have been physically present here on or before June 15th, 2007. And, the word sort of got out that hey, they're giving work permits out in the U.S. and literally, tens of thousands of young people flocked in from Central America just because they heard, hey, they're giving out benefits. You can go get a work permit. Maybe if you stay illegal long enough, there'll be another amnesty and some other kind of hope for you in the future. So now's the time to show up. And so, again, because there was sort of a carrot dangled out there, hey, look, the government's doing something for people that are here illegal, it served as a big motivator for just great numbers of new illegal aliens to show up at the border. And so I think that's part of the government's plan, is to make it unappealing to just show up and try to enter the U.S. Illegally.
Okay, why can't everybody who wants to be in our country just show up and be in our country? Why is that a problem?
Well,
is it a problem?
Yeah, it is a problem. And I think where it's unfair, I think a lot of people have this notion that that these people that want to come to the U.S. are breaking the law just because they don't feel like going through the trouble of doing it the legal way. What's wrong with these people? Why can't they just do it the right way? And the truth is, for the vast majority of these people, there is no way for them to apply to enter the U.S. On a long-term basis. It's just, there's only very limited numbers of ways that you can immigrate to the United States. And so they come here without permission, because if they're going to get to the U.S., that's the only way they can do it. There is no, even if they were to apply and get a temporary visa, let's say they successfully went to the U.S. consulate and got a visitor visa. Well, they would typically be allowed to stay in the U.S. for up to 6 months. But then what happens? They're either going to overstay or they're supposed to go home. And approximately half of the people that are here in the U.S. illegally are people that did enter legally. They entered the U.S. as a visitor, as a student, as a temporary worker. They had to go to a U.S. consulate, present themselves, apply for a visa, convince the consulate that they are a good candidate to return to their home country. They convinced them they had no immigrant intent. I'm going to go to the U.S. just temporarily, and then I'll return home when my temporary stay is over. And then they get here and then they like it. They decide, I don't want to go back. And close to half the people that are here illegally are people that did in fact enter with inspection. So just sort of shutting down the border or increasing border security will only stop some percentage of illegal immigration. It's not going to control all of it. And that's part of the issue with our system, is trying to also find ways to have better security on the interior, tracking people that enter the U.S., figuring out, keeping track of who has left on time and who has not. It's a big task for the government when you think about how many international airports that we have, how many thousands of international visitors come and go every single day. This country is a really big place, and it's not easy to track all of the movement of these individuals who come from foreign countries on a temporary basis.
How does the government decide who's allowed to be here?
Well, immigration benefits are divided into two main categories: temporary and permanent. So you have a lot of people that just come here on a temporary basis. And a lot of these people, they don't necessarily need a sponsor. They can maybe apply to attend a university. They want to come study to get an undergraduate or graduate degree. You have a great many people that just want to be a tourist. They just want to come and visit, Mickey Mouse, or they want to, go to the Empire State Building. Something, they want to come see the U.S. They can apply for a visa on their own. And then you have other people that come temporarily because U.S. employers have sponsored them to come work for a certain length of time, 1 or 2 or 3 years under some different work program. The other class of benefits are permanent. These are people that are going to come and immigrate here. Their intent is expressed clearly from the beginning. I'm applying for permanent resident status in the U.S. That means they're going to live here on a permanent basis. And the way you do that primarily is by being the beneficiary of a petition filed either by a close family member or by an employer. Those are the two main ways to immigrate to the U.S. So if you don't have a close relative, and I'm talking like mother, father, husband, wife, brother, sister, or a child, that's it. There's no grandparent, cousin, mother-in-law, nephew. I mean, you can't sponsor these other relatives. It really has to be a very close relative In the employment-based cases, they have categories depending on what type of work it is. And quite often, through employment is quite difficult. You have to, in many cases, you have to establish first with the Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor, that you've made a good faith effort to recruit workers, and you've demonstrated that you could not find a suitable worker. You couldn't find a worker who was qualified or willing to take this job. You have to prove that you have the money to pay the prevailing wage. You have to prove that you're not harming the local labor market. So it's a very involved process to do that. But those are the two main ways to immigrate. So you can't just be in your home country and wake up one day and just decide you're going to go to the U.S. consulate in your home country and say, I want to go live in America. Well, how can I do this? It's not simple. There's absolutely no line you can get into where you can just register and say, I want to come to the U.S. So I think out of frustration, you have a lot of people that want to come here. They really don't have any business immigrating here. They don't have a way to do it. And so they just take it upon themselves to either enter as a non-immigrant and overstay, or just enter without inspection whatsoever.
And it seems to me that somehow, in part of the conversation, like, on the grand spectrum through the media or wherever we're having these conversations, that somehow we've gotten this attitude that people who want to be here should be allowed to be here. Like, end of story. And that's just not necessarily reality when it comes to all of this.
Well, this is just my opinion. This is not based in law at all. I've said this a number of times to anybody that would be willing to listen. But I think at a certain point, the equities begin to flip the other way. I think when somebody has been here in the U.S. for not a very long period of time and they don't have any substantial ties to the U.S., the argument to throw them out, it's a very easy one to make. The fact is we have enjoyed illegal labor, people that didn't have permission to work. They've been employed. U.S. companies are hiring them, paying wages, withholding taxes, and we've been getting the benefit of their labor year after year after year. And I tried to look for an example. I thought, are there any examples in the law where we reward a lawbreaker? And I came up with one. We have one called easement by prescription, or otherwise maybe known as squatters' rights. So if my neighbor begins to use part of my land, he begins to plow part of it, plants corn, he's completely encroaching on my land, and he does it in an open, it's a notorious hostile act, and I do nothing to protect my rights. I allow him to trespass year after year after year. At a certain point, the equities flip, and if I try to then throw him out of my property, if I wait too long, I've lost my right to do that, and now this person has a right to continue to use that land. So as a country, if we have allowed these workers to work here year after year after year, we know where these people are. It's ludicrous to say that we don't. We can go to any of these plants, any of these farms, construction sites, and round people up anytime we want to. We've not done it because it's not been in our country's interest to do it, I don't think. And so we allow it to go unchecked year after year after year. Now, in terms of, as a practical matter, you're asking what's the reality, the practical reality. I think that when people say, well, these people have been here so long, and Paul, you're making this great point, it's unfair to kick them out. It is, and yet if we just grant a blanket amnesty, are we just providing another carrot for a whole nother round of illegal immigration? So my personal view on this is I hope we get to a point where the government can establish some order at the border where they can say the border is now secure. We have, reduced illegal immigration to a much more manageable level where it's, it becomes the exception and not the rule, that the border is secure, and now we can turn our attention as to what to do with the millions of people that are in the U.S. Who have jobs here, they own property, they have children here, to provide a way, I'm going to call it amnesty or however you want to call it. This is, again, all this stuff gets so politicized, and people on either side, you've got the people on the right that are saying, oh, the left just wants open borders and we need to just, crack down and enforce the law. I don't think anybody wants just strict enforcement because of what it would do to us economically. The people on the left I don't know that they really want open borders. They say these crazy things. We need to get rid of ICE. We need to get rid of, all these restrictions on immigration. You can't have that either. We need to have some sort of middle ground. Most of my clients, they're not clamoring to be here so they can vote for Democrats. I mean, that's not that's not the goal. If you told most of my clients that they could just qualify for a work permit and have the ability to travel home and visit their mama at Christmas, I think they'd be happy. They're more than willing to pay taxes. They make up part of the labor force, and I think that we should find some way to better integrate them into society in a legal way and recognize the contributions that they've already made. There has to be, I think, a common sense approach that works in a way that respects the law and national security, but at the same time reduces the negative aspect of this carrot, where people continue to be seduced by the hope of entering the U.S. illegally and the hopes that they can stay in the future. So we do need border security, and hopefully that would lead to getting some type of immigration reform in the future.
All right, somebody asked about, and okay, we can scroll down. Is there a way for these parents to get their children back? I've read so much conflicting information about reunification, including that the children will be adopted rather than reunited with family.
I don't know. I think if you lose your child and you reach out, if you're a Mexican citizen, for example, and you're trying to find your child, if you reach out, to your consulate or to the authorities, I think the efforts are going to be made to match up your child. I don't think they're just trying to take children on purpose just for fun. I think that if they reach out to their governmental authority or to the U.S. consulate and say, hey, my kid is in the U.S., I need to get him back. This is the last time I saw them, and provide a description and have information that the children would be reunited. And I did mention, I think the last time we were talking about the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where efforts are already made, especially when children are unaccompanied, to match up children with either family members or a close relative or a family friend that's been designated to care for this child. So I think efforts are made already to do this. I don't know, how many cases there really are where children are not reunified with their families. Can it happen? I'm sure it can. But from what I can tell, it looks like every effort's made to allow parents to be reunified with their children.
The reality is not necessarily like this is a war situation where,
I mean, the truth is, think about this. There's so many children that immigrate. I mean, even just, young teenagers or young kids that just cross the border on their own. I mean, they just end up getting separated. This is something that happens. They are taking a big risk. They're crossing the border in the manner that they're doing it. They do take a risk, and so often, this is the thing that's really disheartening, is when you see people who've entered the U.S. illegally. They sort of establish themselves here, and then they send money back home, and they pay these traffickers money to smuggle their kids into the U.S. And the children are subjected to really just terrible conditions. A lot of bad things happen. Really bad things. I mean, some kids just don't make it. These people are not the most scrupulous. You may have agreed on a set price, and then they get halfway here and they decide they need more money. So it's very, very, very difficult. But I do think that the news, they tend to just play up this idea of kids are in cages and they're just yanking them away from their parents. And, if it was just 100 people showing up, it probably wouldn't happen. When you have thousands of people showing up and the government is forced to deal with how to manage these cases, how do you appropriately follow the law? How do you manage their claims for asylum? How do you feed them, clothe them, house them, during this time period? Should we allow them to stay here? It's very, 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 very difficult.
Yeah. What do you think is the reality of political affiliation or the political bent of the president and view of immigration and the reality of that. Like you can have, because I remember when Obama was in office and there was a lot of talk about sweeping changes with immigration, some big stuff was going to happen, and then it never really came through. And similarly with Trump, some of the things sort of in the opposite direction, and there's a lot of talk that I think gets voters moving, you know, they're motivated one way or the other, that doesn't necessarily come to pass, you know, and then there's like sort of the political parties and then the reality of immigration. Can you talk about that a little?
Obviously, you know, the topic of immigration is highly politicized, and even each of the parties is split within themselves. You know, within the Republican Party, you definitely have the sort of the law and order contingent that's, you know, very much against illegal immigration, or against immigration, period, really, for that matter. But then you have the big business side of the Republican Party that knows that they want the labor, they need the labor, and they want their businesses to prosper. They want to be able to hire the workers that they need. And so the party is sort of split, and I would suggest the Democrats are kind of in the same boat where, you know, very much they have this humanitarian sort of concern where we need to, you know, respect the rights of these people. We need to be helpful to these people that, you know, they reach out and they come from these really very, you know, tragic circumstances, oftentimes very difficult. We need to be, you know, show compassion for these people and try to help them. But then they're also the party of labor, and then all this illegal, just immigrant labor in general, may tend to depress wages, and so the labor unions aren't always wild about having all these foreign workers show up. So even each of the parties themselves are sort of split. I think, to me, and this is true of other issues as well, you know, to me the most tragic part of it all is that we're looking for political solutions, and it doesn't appear that either side is willing to compromise in any real way to accomplish some program or reform that's going to solve the problem. It's much easier just to point out the flaw of the other party, or to blame the other party when things are not going well, when things are bad at the border, or there's other issues. You know, every time an illegal alien commits a crime, everybody just goes crazy. Oh my gosh, you know, there's murders every day. I mean, it's just, you know, the things that the media will focus on, they will put out the headlines that they want you to see and get all excited about this or that. All this talk about, you know, they're coming here to commit crimes. Yeah, they do commit crimes. I mean, if you got that many people, crimes will be committed. Or they're coming to steal all these benefits. You know, the people that enter the country illegally, by and large, are here for one reason, and that's employment. They can get jobs here. They can earn good money. Our country is a wonderful place. They can live here in a much more safe and secure environment. Who wouldn't want that? And that's what everybody wants. You know, the problem is coming up with a system that's going to be fair to everybody, and it's not easy. But I think if we wanted to stop illegal immigration, it could be accomplished pretty quickly. But what it would require is very unpalatable. You know, the number one reason people come to the U.S. illegally is for jobs. There are jobs in this country. If you came up with a system of really much more intense employer sanctions, right now, all employers must complete a Form I-9. It's an immigration form. They're supposed to have it for every single employee. You must document that they have the right to work. The only people that can work in this country is someone who's either a U.S. citizen, a permanent resident, or they have a work permit or a work visa. That's it. So if you told an employer, if you don't have an I-9, you're going to be fined $50,000 for each violation, and they really actually did it, you know, I think you'd see a big drop in illegal immigration. But we're not going to do that. That's really the source. The source of it is the draw of the jobs. If you took that away, you know, and it's interesting, over the years when the economy goes down, especially like in construction, for example, when the housing market went down, you know, a number of years back, like in 07, 08, when things got bad, a lot of my clients just went back home. You know, they don't need to be unemployed here in the U.S. They can just go back home and be unemployed or work for lower wages. So we need a system that really makes economic sense as well.
Why don't we do that? Do the fine?
Every time, you know, you talked about the different, you know, presidents that we've had. President Trump, he just announced today, he made a speech about his idea for immigration reform and going more to a kind of a Canadian model where they have a merit-based system. So it'd be focused much more on employment-based as opposed to a family. Right now, 2/3 of our immigrants come from family petitions, 1/3 is employment, and he's proposing sort of flipping that where it's 2/3 employment, only 1/3 family. So that's his idea that he's come up with recently, and that's been floated in the past. We've had many reforms proposed. President Obama had some, President Bush had some really good ones. We've had a number of different plans that were proposed, under different administrations. Some have been voted on successfully in the Senate. To me, the one that really came the closest, that had the best chance, was 2013. I was shocked after President Obama won his second term to hear John Boehner immediately after the election. He said, "I guess this means we're going to have immigration reform." And I about fell out of my chair. I said, I can't believe that man just said those words. But he really talked about it. He said, "Oh, we lost the election. I guess we need to appeal to Hispanic voters. What are we going to do? I guess we need to get this reform done." And then you had the Gang of Eight. You had these senators that got together, came up with a plan. The Senate voted on it. It passed in the Senate. But in the meantime, Obamacare raised its ugly head, and it went through that whole trauma of the manner in which it was approved, and it was so distasteful to the Republicans that when this immigration bill came up, even though it passed in the Senate, the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, said, "I will not put this bill on the floor for a vote." They had enough votes to approve it, but because a majority of his party would not vote for it, that bill never made the floor. So, had that 2013 reform bill gone through, the immigration problem potentially would have been in the rearview mirror, and I would suggest that maybe President Trump or Donald Trump would have not run for office the way that he did, and probably not successfully, because that was his big issue that he campaigned on. So we've had very close calls with immigration reform, but sadly it's not happened. President Obama made all kinds of promises and really didn't follow through with any of them. I don't know why. Again, it's just easier sometimes just to pass the buck, to point at the other party and say, "See, it's their fault. Everything's messed up because those guys won't cooperate." And the problem is the loudest voices in the room are the ones that sort of are having their way, and no one is willing to compromise. No one will give.
All right. What about these caravans? What are your opinion on the caravans that were approaching the border? A few years back, this wasn't happening.
I don't know how to really respond to that. I don't know enough about the caravans. I mean, I see it's on the news. Oh, there's 1,000, 2,000, 3, 4, however many are approaching. I don't really know what's behind that, to be honest with you. Again, depending on which news outlet you listen to, they're gonna lead you to believe that one side is completely funding this and they're doing this for whatever their motives are to create havoc. I don't know. I can tell you this though, that with or without these caravans, thousands of people try to enter the U.S. all the time. I mean, there's constantly people entering the U.S. legally and illegally, whether it be through a caravan or not. The thing that's made the system sort of not grind to a halt, but the thing that is overloading the system at this point in terms of dealing with people entering the U.S. illegally are people that are showing up at the border and asking for asylum, and that really is a problem. Really, and I heard this proposed, the former head of Homeland Security, or maybe just the former head of ICE. I just heard him speak. He had a message out today, and he makes a very good point. I don't know how they come up with the criteria for what's called a credible fear determination. If you show up at the border and you say, "I'm scared to go home," and you give them a reason, that is a very low threshold. It's not near enough to make a successful claim for asylum. Asylum is very hard to qualify for. There are bad things that happen in the world all the time. There's criminal actions that take place. There's criminal element. Any place you go, there are bad things that happen. You have to prove that you are afraid to return to your home country because you're being persecuted. But the persecution, it has to be based on one of 5 factors, either because of your race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And that is a very high standard. And so I'm not certain, I think we do need to re-examine why we let people in at the border who say, I'm scared because of the drug cartel. They're kidnapping people, they're shooting people. My neighbor was, shot and killed. A local drug lord came and wanted to take over my farm. That's a terrible thing. I mean, obviously we understand why they're scared. It's a very normal reaction. They're scared, they're fleeing for their lives. That's just fleeing common crime is not going to be grounds for asylum. It's unfortunate. Cal Thomas, he had an article today talking about the approach that Hungary takes with dealing with illegal immigration. They've really are much more creative. Again, I think it's unfair sometimes. Mr. Thomas was sort of saying that Hungary got it right. They're much smaller than we are. I think we have to take that into account in terms of how we handle things. We are a nation of immigrants in terms of just the diversity of our population. So we have a much different history and geography and a lot of other things at play. But he said they basically just don't have welfare, and so it's not nearly as attractive to go there. But they do have illegal entrants, and what they do is that when they repatriate these people, they really have a very good system for trying to work with the countries from which these people are coming from and donating money, not to the governments. They don't put the money in the hands of a government which may or may not be corrupt or certainly may misappropriate the money. They put the money in the hands of nonprofit groups, religious organizations who have missions for better health care or education or other programs for the betterment of the people in those countries to help alleviate or reduce the motivation for people to enter that country illegally. That's not a bad plan. I think maybe we could emulate Hungary in some way. I saw a headline today, or somebody made a comment that Japan is for Japan first, and not taking any refugees. Yeah, Japan's a tiny island, okay? Yeah, obviously not. They barely have enough room for the Japanese, let alone other people. To compare us to that is kind of silly. This country's a big place. I think we can absorb an awful lot of immigrants. We take in 1 million new legal immigrants every year, which is quite a lot. This country is amazing. I love this place. And we have the ability to absorb an awful lot of people. And they go to work and they contribute to this country. We need to find a way, to allow people to enter in a legal fashion, in a dignified fashion, in a way that's consistent with our country's history and consistent with our economic need. When unemployment is low and we have so many employers trying to find people, we should have programs that allow these employers to find the people that they want. If they happen to be from foreign countries, then so be it.
Okay. So that's all we're going to discuss tonight. We've been on here for about an hour. I think that's a good amount of time. So we'll do this again, maybe in a week or two. We got a few interesting comments. DACA was just a political move. And then somebody asking about jobs and cheap labor with immigrants, which I think is an interesting topic, and we talked a lot about that last time, and maybe we can circle around and talk about it next week. So for tonight, that is it. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'm going to save it and then repost it, and so feel free to share it and send along any questions, and maybe we can do another round of discussing things. So good night. Thank you guys for joining us. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Love you. Okay, so we'll end.